Welcome to the Seed Family Podcast,
where we explore natural, homeschooling, gentle parenting,
simple living, and family adventure.
I'm Rachel Rainbolt, the Sage Parenting Coach, coming to you from the Pacific Northwest, where I live wild and free in connection with my 3 wildlings and the Papa Bear in our fixer-upper on the beach. This is episode 74, and today I'm here with Dr. Miriam Kirmayer talking about friendship. Miriam is a clinical psychologist and leading friendship expert who has studied the science of social connection for over a decade. Her work focuses on helping others cultivate resilience and self-compassion, navigate life transitions, and build stronger relationships with the people who matter most. So join us around the campfire and let's get living the family life of our dreams. This is an episode about friendship, and one of the best ways I have made and nurtured friendships is through Hack School, the homeschool adventure club that I created. We have gotten so much out of it that I created a course to help you set up and run your very own called Hack School Leadership. This course will teach you how to build the like-minded community you long for while exploring your region anew and learning through adventure as a family. Hack School has been our simple answer to the homeschooling, what about socialization question, but I readily admit that I have gotten just as much out of the friendships this club has nourished as my children. Regularly connecting with other like-minded families and friendship, priceless. I am very excited about this episode as I have wanted to share a conversation with an expert on friendship since I started this podcast 4 years ago. It has literally, it was like one of those original episode ideas that I had when I first started the podcast, and my hunger for this conversation about friendship for us as mothers or as parents has only grown since then. So an enthusiastic welcome to the show, Miriam. Will you introduce yourself and share a bit about who you are and what you're passionate about?
Of course. Thanks so much for having me. 4 years. That's amazing. So I'm a clinical psychologist by training, and I have a private practice based in Montreal, Canada, that is fairly general. So I work with people who are experiencing all kinds of life challenges, struggles, experiences, anxiety, depression, life transitions and changes, and relationship difficulties. And that really makes up a big part of the work that I do. And the part of that that's a little bit unique, and definitely I think what we're going to be focusing on today, is friendship therapy. So that really stemmed from some of the research that I've done on adult friendships for the better part of the last decade, working to answer questions about how do we make friends? Where are all these friends? How do we maintain our friendships when life gets busy and we're new parents? How do we end our friendships with people that we no longer feel connected to? And really working to understand the link between the quality of our friendships and our mental health and physical well-being. So I have a lot of other aspects of my work that fall under the umbrella of friendship, but I think those are the big things to just point out at first, at least, is the research side of things, and then also my one-on-one work with clients.
Yes. Okay. So let's start right there with one of those things you just said about the importance of friendship. I think a lot of us feel this deep longing for social connection, but we might not recognize it as that, or we might try to talk ourselves out of that need. But friendship is important, right?
It really is. The importance can't be overstated. And I mean, I recognize my bias here, right? I mean, anyone listening is going to say, well, of course she's going to say that. This is her area of expertise and what she, talks about and writes about. But this is one of the reasons why I went into this field to begin with, because there's so much that's coming out showing the importance of feeling socially connected to the important people in our lives. That includes absolutely our partners, our families, our communities, but there's also something very crucial about our friendships. And so a lot of the statistics and research that are coming out show that feeling connected to our friends specifically actually helps us to live longer and healthier lives. So we see that we have certainly better resilience. We're more able to cope with hardship. Our mental health is improved. We're less likely to struggle with anxiety, depression. And the interesting thing actually is that it's not just about getting rid of or coping with hardship, so to speak. It's also a matter of improving our well-being. And so we're not just less likely to struggle, but we actually experience greater happiness and life satisfaction. We are less likely to suffer from the common cold. We are less likely to suffer from chronic health conditions. It really ends up being actually one of the most significant and strongest predictors of not just how healthy we are, but how long we live. So the importance just really, can't be overstated enough. And that's, as I said, part of why I wanted to go into this field.
Every time I feel like, there's this, like, often we find ourselves in nowadays in this sort of evolutionary mismatch where, like, we're having these needs that are going unmet and we're not really recognizing them as that, like, we're not quite able to see what the need is often. For example, maybe we're just feeling the pain of all of those, the inverse of lacking all those benefits you're describing from friendship. But it's hard to, like, put our finger on, particularly when in our society around us, we don't see, I mean, we'll talk later about, like, what we see in TV and movies, but like, a lot of people are also lacking this. And so it's harder to recognize. And when that happens, like, looking toward what the studies are telling us, what the evidence is showing us is super helpful. And I also love taking that evolutionary standpoint where we can kind of zoom back out on the timeline and look at, like, historically the role that friendships have played, like how we were evolutionarily designed to thrive. I find sometimes helpful to give me clues about, like, is this need, like, real, right? Like, is this really important? So there's, like, the research and then there's the evolutionary side, because we really were designed to thrive in connection with more than just one romantic partner, right?
Absolutely. Oh, I love what you said there. And there's so much to unpack. What it really makes me think of is the value of loneliness. And that's certainly a big thing that comes up a lot in my work and in my own life. I mean, we can all relate to that feeling of being lonely, which I should point out is different from the experience of being alone. And it's a very uncomfortable place to be. And it's sometimes difficult to recognize, which I think you also kind of alluded to, that we don't always, have the capacity to get in touch with our emotions in that way, or we're distracted, or we've come to see it as something else. And so oftentimes in therapy, in my work with clients, I see that we're really likely to label loneliness as something else. We feel this sense of, we're not necessarily feeling that sense of fulfillment. We feel sad. We're feeling bored even. We're feeling that emptiness. And sometimes those are all clues that what we're actually feeling is lonely. And that feeling is incredibly painful. And we often feel very alone in our loneliness. But I think when we can approach that in two ways, one is to normalize this, that I am not alone in feeling this. This is a universal emotion, and that there's an evolutionary value there. It exists to ideally help us channel that into our need for connection. And so sometimes the best way to cope with loneliness is really just to let it wash over us, because emotions build and they do come down. But sometimes it's a bit of a helpful clue that, okay, I want to invest in my need for connection and my need to connect with friends, because perhaps I haven't been prioritizing that in the same way I have my other felt duties or relationships or obligations.
Oh, yes. I love everything you said there. Like, that emotions can be signals to some unmet needs or to some misalignment with values. So let's say, like, we have identified that we're feeling this absence, like this longing, right, for this type of connection that we're not experiencing. How do we make friends in motherhood? Because it really is kind of a particular context that comes with its own set of challenges.
It is. And again, I relate to this professionally, having worked with a lot of mothers in my practice and my work on friendship. And I relate to this personally as a, relatively new mom to two young boys. It can be a very big juncture when it comes to our friendship experiences, because for many of us, for the first time in a long time, we're suddenly in a position where we feel the need to connect with new friends for various reasons. Perhaps because up until this point, we hadn't necessarily been in touch with that loneliness or how isolating motherhood can be, and we're really looking for support. Perhaps because we're the first in our group of friends to have children, and so we're really looking to build those connections with other moms or parents. But it can be very difficult when all of a sudden we get in touch with that need and we think to ourselves, well, what do I do? How do I connect with these so-called mom friends? So there are a lot of different ways to approach this. And I think this is the interesting thing about making friends. There isn't just one right path for people to take. So for some people, it can be incredibly helpful to turn online, especially right now when so many of our connections are taking place virtually. So, I mean, there are apps that have been developed specifically to help people meet and connect with new friends. And there are some specifically geared towards mothers and parents. And so that can be a helpful starting point. I also know many people who have connected with other friends through parenting groups, whether those are taking place in real life or online. But I also find a really helpful starting point is to reach out to your existing social network, that we can let people know that we're looking to meet new friends and ask them to connect us with people that they know who they think we might get along with. That's a really meaningful place to start, because it kind of allows us to expand our social network or social group in a way that can feel very, very natural, very organic.
Yes, two of my closest friends were the result of some of that, like a bit of that matchmaking where people reached out and they were like, oh, there's this friend I have and you guys absolutely have to be friends. You have so much in common. Every time I hang out with her, I think of you, you guys need to meet. Like that is how my two closest friends that I'm thinking of right now at the top of my head, like my nearest and dearest friends, that is how we met, by that like friendship matchmaking.
I love that. Yeah. And it definitely can be, as I said, very meaningful, very successful. People are often very excited about the possibility of doing that kind of good deed and connecting us. The caveat to all that is that doesn't necessarily mean that we'll get along, right? That just because we have a friend in common or we know someone in common, or for that matter, just because we're both parents or mothers, right? That doesn't necessarily mean that will translate into a friendship or a close friendship. But it's certainly worth a try as a starting point.
So part of it, it sounds like, is like showing up for these things. For like for my example, there have been many times where people have said, hey, you have to get together with this person, and we got together and it wasn't a great fit, and that's okay too. But you kind of have to show up and put yourself out there a little bit in order to make those meaningful connections. Yeah.
No, exactly. Yeah. I mean, how many times, not just being set up on friend dates, but how many times are we invited to, I was just invited to a music class last week and I couldn't make it. But how many times do we say no to these kinds of opportunities where we might have the chance to connect with somebody new, right? It's so easy to dismiss it as, I don't have the time, I don't have the energy, I'm not able to go. And the reality is, making friends, meeting friends, it does take a significant investment of our time and energy. And when we are parents, we only have so much to give. We're already, depleted a lot of the time. And so it really is hard. And I think it's important to validate that side of it, that making friends doesn't always feel easeful in the beginning, that it can feel effortful. And that doesn't mean that that there's anything wrong with us. That doesn't mean that we're doing it wrong. It's just that it takes time to develop a friendship. It takes time to find the right friends. And it really is worth it in the end. And it's, holding space for both of those realities.
And it's kind of a bit like dating in the sense that you will, like, even if you get together with someone and it's not like the most incredible fit, you still learn about yourself and your needs and your family's needs when you show up for those experiences. So there's still value in that showing up and in moving through that experience, even if it isn't like a true love connection. Right?
Yeah. No, that's a very important point, because we so often minimize the value of our more casual social connections or moments of connection. And we can feel like, there's sunk costs here. And I've quote unquote wasted time by pursuing this friendship and it didn't work out. or I went to this music class and I didn't meet anyone, and that was incredibly disappointing. And what I think helps is exactly what you just did there, which is to focus on the meaning. What can I learn from this experience about myself as a parent, about myself as a friend, about myself as a human, and to also just recognize the value in those small moments of connection. There was some research coming out that came out not too long ago that spoke about the value we experience in moments of connection actually with strangers, and that we far too easily underestimate how meaningful those conversations really are, and they really do fill us up in a way that we, I think, don't often expect or appreciate.
Yes. Oh, yes. I so agree with all of that. Oh, I'm so excited. This is such a good conversation. See, I am getting a tremendous amount out of this conversation. I think like one of the things that we can feel, one of the things I want to highlight is how you said, like, it feels like I don't have time or they don't have the energy to do this. And I really do try to think of, your time as sort of like an accounting of your values. Like, let me look at your calendar and I can see your values. Well, if you're having this need or you're feeling this challenge or this struggle, and you want to, like, you can categorize it as like self-care, right? Or you can categorize it as like mental health, or you can categorize it as physical health. Like you said, like we get all these benefits on all these levels of friendship. So trying to, like, when you have an invitation or when you have an opportunity, it can be so easily to dismiss it as I don't have time. But what if it was like, this is your doctor's appointment, like to get the support you need, or to get this physical need met. I mean, you've got to kind of give it the same importance. And that can be hard for us to do as mothers, to put like meeting our own needs at the top of that pile. But I think friendship in particular is such a good one to invest in, because it meets so many things at the same time. Like if you're showing up at a park, like to hang out with this person, your kids are getting outdoors, they're running around with their kid. Like, so even if it's not a perfect match with this person that you're showing up and putting yourself out there with, like there's still so many kind of spheres of, like, if we look at like everybody's needs as a Venn diagram, there's so much overlap in showing up for these kinds of things.
Yes. Yeah. Again, I just love how you've put that. And, I always say something to the effect of, it's really easy to see investing in our friendships as being at odds with our other relationships and responsibilities, when really it's foundational. It's just so connected with the sense of satisfaction and fulfillment that we experience in so many different areas of our lives, that it doesn't have to be one or the other. It could be one via the other. And the other piece of that you said that really resonates with me is, I'm often asked by parents, what can I do to support my child's well-being, certainly, but also their relationships, right? How can I help them to develop close, healthy friendships, to experience their worthiness as a person and as a friend? And truthfully, one of the most powerful things we can do is to invest in our own friendships, because we're sending the message very clearly and modeling to our children that social connection is important, and that it's worth prioritizing in our lives. And our kids notice that. They notice when we're taking time to see a friend, connect with a friend, talking about our friends, initiating. That's something that so many of us struggle with, initiating plans, or being the first one to reach out. And so when our children can see us doing that and making space for that in our lives, it's incredibly powerful.
Yes. Gosh, I got together with someone who I hadn't ever gotten together with in real life the other day, and my kids were there. And then as we were leaving on the way home, my kids were asking me all these like amazing, juicy questions, so how did it feel for you? Like, what was your favorite like moment of connection with them? Or like, what topic did you enjoy talking about? Or what felt like hard about, like, they're just asking me all these really great questions that I know, like I would ask them, like after they would play with other kids. And I totally agree. I'm just like highlighting what you said about that role modeling component, that it really is, like, often we are sort of talking the talk, but not walking the walk. So let's like hold space for our friendship needs at the same time. And then the one last thing that I just have to highlight while we're talking about how to make friends, that I feel like I'm just going over everything you're saying with a highlighter, but that you said earlier about kind of what's like in your sphere of control. So I sometimes talk about the difference between goals and intentions, and goals are like outcome oriented. And I don't like them for as many things as I like intentions, because there's a lot that we can't control. So I would say that, like, showing up and putting yourself out there with the intention of like nourishing your friendship needs, like it's not outcome based. If you bring to it like, this is my intention, is to show up for myself in for this friendship need, like then the outcome doesn't matter because it's not within your control. What is within your control is like that I'm showing up and that I'm opening my heart and mind and I'm learning more about myself and I'm learning more about what my needs are. And I'm sort of carving out the space for that and holding the space for that. All that stuff is within your control.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. I feel like I'm also here taking notes on everything that you're saying. So thank you. Thank you for sharing that.
Okay, so say we've made these friendships, we've put ourselves out there, we've been vulnerable, we held that space. How can we cultivate closer connections with the friends that we have?
Yeah. So I really like to highlight here the two important aspects to friendships, and that is really finding that elusive balance between frequency and quality. Now, what I mean by that is, it just as it takes time to, meet these friends and make a friend, it really takes time to cultivate that closer, trusting connection. And this is actually something that has been quantified through research in a really interesting way. So what we see is that it takes about 50 hours to cultivate, let's call it an acquaintanceship or a casual friendship. About 100 hours to go to a closer friendship, and 200 for a best friendship. And so it really does take quite a bit of time to build, as I said, that closeness, that intimacy, that trust. But that is also important to balance with the quality of the interactions we're having, because it's not the case that just, sitting next to somebody in a room is going to necessarily lead to that closeness. It really is a matter of how are we spending that time together and how are we investing in that friendship in meaningful ways. And that's where the importance of, I used this word before, but intimacy and self-disclosure really comes in. So self-disclosure is really just a fancy term for sharing information about ourselves with our friends that we probably wouldn't share with strangers, or at least not all of it, not right away. But sharing our inner world and our inner experiences, who we are, our likes, our dislikes, our perspectives, our values, our experiences, all of those types of conversations over time create a sense of familiarity that's really important, a sense of closeness and trust, and can really help us move from casual acquaintances to close friends. So it really is that balance, as I said, between frequency and intimacy. And, part of that intimacy, it just makes me think of the importance of authenticity and being honest about who we are, what we're celebrating, what we're struggling with. And we are so conditioned to glossing over the harder, messier parts of life. And I think this can be especially true for parenthood and motherhood, and social media definitely has a role to play here. But it really does us a terrible disservice, both with respect to our mental health and our relationships, because nobody wants a perfect friend. That doesn't feel great, right? We want a friend who we can be ourselves around, who we feel like who trusts us enough to be themselves around us too.
Yes. Oh, so much good stuff. Like being vulnerable and how we show up with those relationships is how they go deeper. I think too, when we're talking about friendship, for a lot of us, particularly for a lot of us women, it can be sort of the last domain that we really start working on a lot of these like conflict resolution skills and just like how to be in like intentional conscious connection, like mindfulness and all that. Like it tends to start with our relationship with our kids, because we're so motivated, particularly for us, all of us gentle parents. We're so motivated to start building these skills and developing these skills. And then it starts to extend to our partnership, as we realize, oh, these are actually just all the skills we use to be in like healthy, meaningful connection with other humans. And then we start figuring out like, oh, we can extend this to our friendships too. And that feels like this whole next level of vulnerable, because it's someone, kind of like outside of your house. Like they're less invested and kind of stuck with you, right? Like your kids might be, or might feel like more like your partner is. So we start then trying to extend these to our friendships. And I love when I can see that in people. And it's so rewarding to see it in myself too, really. Like so many of us have baggage, from growing up and what friendships may have been like or felt like, or patterns that we're trying to break out of. And when we can bring all those same skills that I talk about in every episode of this podcast with gentle parenting into our friendships, it can be so, so, so rewarding as the quality of those relationships go up too.
Yes, there is so much truth there. I think part of it is as you said, kind of by necessity to some extent, right? I mean, we are around our children and around our partners, and ideally we find a way to navigate the conflicts that will inevitably arise in a way that feels aligned with our values and supports the kind of environment and family system that we're really motivated to co-create. And friendships can be a natural extension of that. But I also think there's another piece to this, which is that we do openly champion and emphasize the importance of conflict resolution and healthy communication. And certainly, the gentle parenting movement has really gained momentum in a really, really meaningful way. And yet we don't really hear the same kinds of conversations being had about our friendships. I think I've certainly seen things change over the last few years in terms of the conversations that are being had and the people who are reaching out to me for commentary about this. But we really don't talk, for example, about the importance of making time for quality time in our friendships, or how we can speak to a friend when they've really hurt us in some way, or when we feel betrayed. Those types of friendship skills, which are really just life skills, right?
Yes.
And relationship skills, but we don't talk about them and emphasize the importance of them in the context of our friendships, I guess, whereas we do in our other connections. And so I think that that's part of it, that there's this expectation that friendships, again, should be easy, or that we shouldn't voice our needs, or we shouldn't have to voice our needs or set boundaries in our friendships. And that when we do, there's something inherently wrong either with us or with the friendship, and that we should just cut them loose.
Yeah.
And as I said, I do see that changing slowly, which I think is really a very positive thing, because conflict, it's inevitable in any of our close relationships. And, I've said this before, but the marker of a healthy friendship is not the absence of conflict. It's that willingness to navigate it together. And I think that could be said about any relationship, but it bears repeating when it comes to our friendships.
Oh, that's beautiful. And really, like, all the same things that I talk about, even like the language that I talk about using with children, really, like, all the whole gentle parenting thing is just about connection with other humans. So when I talk about saying to the kids, like, tell me more, or how can I help, or would it feel most helpful to have some feedback from me, or just some reflective listening? Like, what is it that you need? How can I help you meet that need? Like, these are all the same conversations I have with my friends. So like, being willing to kind of extend that skill set out to these friendship relationships can be really valuable. Like, if you have a friend who keeps canceling the things that you're scheduling, and your brain is sort of telling you all kinds of stories about what that means, like, being brave enough to check in directly and have a conversation about that. I'm noticing that you've canceled the last couple dates or the last couple of get-togethers that we scheduled. The story I'm telling myself is that you're hoping to divest in this relationship a bit. And I just wanted to check in with you to see if that was accurate. And being brave enough, like, it really does take bravery when it's with people who are not, like I said, kind of stuck with you. But it just, every time I have those conversations, it leads to like deeper, more meaningful connection.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. I'm smiling here that you use that as an example, because part of the research, again, as I said before, that I did was to look at what are the big challenges or challenging situations that are coming up in our friendships as adults, and what are the situations that are not only difficult to manage, but important, meaning if we don't handle them appropriately, there could be consequences either for our well-being or for the friendship itself, meaning that it's unlikely to last. And this experience of having a friend cancel on you repeatedly, or a friend being inherently unreliable, or the word flaky is thrown around a lot, that was something that came up so often. And the next part of the research that we did was to figure out, well, how should we respond in those situations? What are the different types of strategies that are going to be helpful, again, both for preserving our own well-being and also the friendship? And what you just said there is a beautiful example of the kinds of things that we can say. because it's assertive and gentle at the same time. And it's respecting our needs. We're setting a boundary, right? I'm finding this hard. This is difficult for me. I don't want things to continue in this way, but we're also allowing our friends space to open up about the reasons why this is happening. And yeah, I just think that curiosity can be such a force for connection, really.
Yes, yes. That non-judgmental curiosity can be such a force for connection. I love that. And boundaries too. Like you mentioned earlier, like I have said to a friend who, like, I think you used the word flaky, like who would cancel a lot at the last minute. Like we're like almost there, and then they cancel. And that happened a few times. And then I said, I reached out and talked to this friend and said, we love you dearly. We're happy to show up for connection with you. And I'm also happy to wait until you're ready or able to show up for these things that we're scheduling. And if you're not, that's okay. Like if you're not in the space where you can do that right now, that's okay. Like schedule something with me when you're confident that you're in a space where you can show up for it. So like communicating that like I love you and I want to spend time with you, and holding this boundary that it doesn't work for me to, get my whole family ready and out the door and drive 45 minutes and show up at these places to have you cancel at the last minute. So like, just like with our kids, we can hold boundaries with like respect and compassion. We can do that in our friendships too.
Absolutely.
And it feels good to be on the receiving end of this stuff. Like I've been on the receiving end of it too, where a friend will say like, hey, the story I'm telling myself about what you meant when you said that is ... Like, can I check in with you about that? Is that what your intention was? And of course, most of the time it's like not at all what I intended. It could be like, no, my kid was responding to texts or like something totally crazy. And to know that this friend would have been like just sitting there spinning and like stewing in their feelings completely unnecessarily. I like so appreciate the check-in, or even boundaries. Like if a friend holds boundaries with me, like I totally respect that, because then I can see so clearly what they need. And it might be something that I wasn't even aware of.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's such a valid point. I think sometimes being able to get in touch with how good that can feel does take a bit of inner work, right? Because we need to undo some of the stories that we tell ourselves about what it means to receive boundaries or set boundaries, for example. But I do think, it can provide us with the opportunity to clarify a friend's misconceptions, which can be very positive. And there's more to it as well, right? Because what we're communicating when we set a boundary, or when we are willing to acknowledge a boundary, right, is that I value our friendship. And that's why these boundaries are taking place, because we are working together to create a relationship that's worth preserving. And as long as that message can make its way into conversations about boundaries, or, clarifying misconceptions, it can be hugely healing.
Yes, 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 yes. Okay. One thing that I find helpful is being clear with myself on how each friendship adds value. Because just like your one romantic partner cannot fulfill all of your needs, one lifelong best friend is also unlikely to fulfill all of your friendship needs, despite what a lot of movies and books and TV shows portray. Yes. So it's normal, right, to have like different friends who add value in different ways.
Yes, is it ever? We are speaking the same language now. So I love that you just set me up very nicely. Yes. So this is a theme that definitely shows up in a lot of the work that I do in this area. And you're making me think now quite a bit about some of the posts that I've shared in my online community on Instagram recently, because so often we have all kinds of beliefs about what our friendships should look like, right? And one of those ideas is that we need to have a best friend, or that having that one person who fulfills all of our friendship needs is somehow more rewarding and more important than having different people in our lives who fulfill different needs and contribute to our life in their own special way. And I really do think that belief does us a disservice, because not everyone has a best friend, and we don't need that one person. That's not to minimize, the value of those connections. Having one person that we feel incredibly close to and that we can turn to in any moment is incredibly rewarding and special and deserves to be celebrated. But I think it does us a disservice when we get caught up in that narrative that there's something wrong with us or with our friend group when we don't have that one person. So that is kind of the message that I like to share, that the research certainly doesn't support that we need that one person. And also just our own personal satisfaction in life isn't tied to feeling like there's just one person to go to. And you kind of touched on this before too, which was that, when it comes to our partners, we can't expect a partner to meet all of our needs, right? And that can place a lot of burden on one connection. And that's true of our friends as well. If we feel as though we constantly need to turn to one person at the expense of other people in our lives, that can put a lot of strain on friendships as well. And so instead of focusing on the labels, I think it really does help to, and by labels, I mean this idea of a best friend.
BFF, best friend forever.
Yeah, right. I think it really does help to reflect on, well, what are the different people who I surround myself with? What are they adding to my life? And what can I contribute to theirs in turn? And, the quote that I'm thinking of that I shared not too long ago was, what matters more than the number of friends we have or the labels that we ascribe to our friendships is the quality of the connections that we have, and also that our friendships are reciprocated. And so by that, what I mean is I consider us friends and you would agree. And that sounds very simple, right? But it turns out that about 50% of our friendships are not reciprocated. And so instead of channeling our energy into finding or connecting or cultivating a best friendship, I think what we really want to be thinking about is, how can I invest in co-creating quality connections?
Oh, that's so good. Okay. So first of all, it's very validating that the research supports that, it's unlikely that you're going to have like one best friend and they will meet all of your friendship needs. And really that's been my experience. Like I might have one friend whose connection I nurture because our kids adore each other and play so well together, and things aren't super deep, but that's okay. Like it does meet a need for me and it does feel good. Like it is a value add. And then I might have another friend who loves hiking like I do, and we walk together in nature and have deep, meaningful conversations, and our kids don't get along that well, so we don't bring them. And that's okay too. Yeah. Like, so just to like be given the permission that it's and to have the pressure released that you don't have to have one person who can meet all of your needs.
And there are also seasons to friendships, right? I mean, there may be times in life where we become closer with some of those people with whom we had a more casual connection, and recognizing that fluidity can be very comforting as well. So,
okay. So one thing that you just said that we have to dig deeper into is that reciprocated part, because you talk about like reciprocated, meaningful connections, and that's something that I've struggled with. So you talked a little bit about what you mean by like reciprocated or balanced, but like, what might that look like? How do we know if our friendship is reciprocated or balanced?
Yeah, this is a very interesting question, because there are so many different ways that we could look at this. And I'm wearing simultaneously, my researcher hat here, but I'm also just thinking about my own friendships and friendship experiences that I've had, because, it's almost like a feeling, right? There's a part of me that really wants to quantify this, right? That's the researcher in me. Well, here is what we call operational definition, right? Yes. Here's what it means to have a balanced or reciprocated friendship.
What's the metric?
Right. And I mean, we can go there, we can do that, but I think that it's firstly defined in different ways in the scientific literature. Yeah. And I also think that might actually mean something different for each of us in each of our friendships, because we have different expectations for how much our different friends can and cannot give. And we also have different expectations of ourselves in our friendships in terms of how willing and able we are to show up and to reciprocate. So I actually think it's a lot murkier and messier than we would like it to be. But I do think the spirit of this is very much on the surface, I consider you a friend, you consider me a friend. There may be small differences in terms of how close I think we are versus how close you believe us to be. Mm-hmm. But what matters most, above and beyond even that label of a reciprocated friendship, is that it feels as though both people's needs are being prioritized in the relationship. And I mean, I'm going to go on a bit of a rant here, but this is something a lot about recently, right? It's so easy to expect our friends to respond in kind, right? And when we're thinking about balance or reciprocity in friendships, I mean, the most common metric that comes to mind for me is, okay, well, who's initiating more, right? So I'm the one who always calls and make plans. Or maybe you're the one who's always initiating get-togethers one-on-one or in a friend group, and the other person just isn't putting in their fair share, right? That's a very common imbalance that I see a lot in friendships and that I think all of us can relate to in some small way. But the interesting thing here is that if we take a step back, there can be a lot of other ways that somebody's investing in a friendship, right? So maybe they're not the one to initiate or make plans, but maybe they're really investing by putting a lot of exchanging a lot of emotional support, or really kind of pioneering the importance of being vulnerable and a willingness to share in the relationship. Or maybe they're the first friend to show up when you ask for support of any kind, or when they know that you need some kind of practical help. And so I think that we expect our friends to respond in kind when it comes to reciprocity, but it isn't always such a one-to-one relationship. And so taking that more macro view of the relationship can be helpful, because we can see, okay, are there other ways that my friend is showing me that they're committed to this connection and that they're invested in our relationship? And very often the answer is yes. Now, obviously not always the case, right? Coming back to that stat of a lot of friendships are not reciprocated. And that's not to say there aren't things we can't do to shift the balance, or sometimes those are friendships that you might want to let go of. But I do think it's important for us to turn inward first and to ask ourselves, well, what do we mean when we think of a balanced connection, and what's missing here? And what are the pieces that aren't missing that I'm overlooking?
Yeah. What are my needs, and have I communicated them clearly?
Yes. Oh my gosh. How often do we expect our friends to just know what we need? Again, just like we do the other important people in our lives.
Yes. And like fairness, equality, balance, like, is not the same as fairness. So like a conversation that I would have with my kids a lot, right, is that like fairness isn't sameness. So like you said about, like they may bring us this certain set of strengths, and then you may bring these certain set of strengths, and they might be different, but it can still feel balanced. So it can be hard to put your finger on, like, what exactly does it look like for a friendship to be balanced? But I do have like a clear feeling when I'm in a friendship that is not balanced.
Yeah.
And I find myself in a lot of friendships that only hold space for others' needs. And I have learned to place those relationships in a different place in my heart and life, and to hold stronger boundaries around them, as they do sometimes still add value in particular ways, like we discussed above. Like it might be, that one of my kids and one of their kids like gets along really well, and like that's great. And if they are not adding value, then I will disconnect from them. But it does take its toll. Like I'm very aware of a sense within me when it's too out of balance for me to carry, or there are too many relationships like that, because it does like reinforce my narrative that I am the holder of space for everyone else. And it is active work to expand that narrative, to nurture a world where I can have needs. Like that's some of like my personal work that I have to do. And I suspect I'm not alone in this with my fellow like therapist, helper.
I have a big smile, knowing smile on my face, because I can so relate to this. And I just love that you shared this, because I think it really encourages us to think about, well, what can we do to restore some of the balance in our connections, right? Not just necessarily in a particular friendship, but in our larger social network. Because when we're in an imbalanced relationship, or when we feel like there isn't that reciprocity, it's so easy to go to a place where we are thinking about, well, if this other person just did this more, right? If they just asked me how I'm doing and really meant it, right? If they just picked up the phone and made plans once in a while, that would solve everything, which sure, that would be nice, but we can't control other people, right? As you know, the only thing we have control over is ourselves. And so if we can think about what can I do to restore a little bit more of the balance in this friendship, and that might mean communicating our needs more clearly. That might mean working to actively take up more space in the friendship. That might mean pulling back, right? It can take so many different forms. But if we can ask ourselves that question, then we can work to restore some of the balance or be in a position to gauge whether this is a friendship that we need to reevaluate in some way and set boundaries in, or pull back from, or just shift our expectations.
Yeah, I think for a lot of Enneagram twos, like it's when your capacity is so great, it can be hard to find reciprocal relationships, like with others of equal capacity. But like we've talked about, like equal isn't necessarily sameness. And so when I bring this like neurodiversity even perspective to it, like I might have really high level executive functioning skills and my friend perhaps does not, right? So then maybe more of the planning will fall on me, but I can still communicate my needs in a way that respects their way of being if things feel out of balance. And are they willing to grow in those areas or show up more in those other areas, or are they not? And it's okay if they're not too. And I do have some friendships that are I have enough to feel incredibly blessed that where it does feel reciprocated and it does feel balanced, and they are precious and treasured restorative places of rest for me. So even if it feels uncomfortable to kind of be vulnerable and make these adjustments and really get in touch with how you're feeling about these things, it is so worth it.
Well said.
Okay, and now we're going to go from something happy and optimistic to something maybe a little harder, because sometimes friendships end and that can be painful. So if you decide like this, it's this relationship is not adding value for you, or you guys aren't a good fit, talk to us about friendship breakups. I know you talk about this a lot and I love it. And I want to hear all the things.
Yeah. There's so much that we could explore here, because I think this is, like so much of what we talked about already, one of those life experiences and one of those friendship experiences that we just don't talk enough about. And so people end up feeling simultaneously incredibly hurt when this happens. It's grief that can wash over us when we lose touch with a friend, or when we're going through a friendship breakup, can be palpable. And we also feel very alone. And so what we tend to do when we feel that hurt and when we feel that aloneness is we label, right? We label ourselves. I'm a bad friend. I've done something wrong. What's wrong with me that I've lost this friend? We blame the other person very often. This is their fault. How could they do this to me? And truthfully, neither of those approaches often reflects the full picture of what happened, and really helps us to cope all that much. And so, there's so much that we could explore here in terms of why do friendships end and how do we cope, and is it normal? And the answer is yes, it's so normal. This is an expected and inevitable friendship experience. We cannot hold on to every connection that we make. And so part of the research, again, that I did a couple of years back was to look at the reasons why friendships end. And some of the time, yes, there has been a big betrayal. There has been a big conflict or an ongoing conflict that has led to the demise or dissolution of a friendship. But very often that's not actually why friendships end. It's this more gradual, even passive process of growing apart. Your lives no longer align. Your values are no longer aligned. It's just not a priority to make it work. Or sometimes you really, really want it to work and it just doesn't feel possible. And regardless of the reason why a friendship ends, it can still be painful. And regardless of which side you're on, whether you're the one who initiated this or not, it can still be painful. And so I really think a big, big piece of this is acknowledging that pain, because society expects us to just get over it. And we certainly place that pressure on ourselves, and that does us no favors.
Yeah. Earlier I talked about like that illusion of, or that idealized like best friend forever thing. And this really brings to the forefront, like the forever part, like the time part, like that it's okay for people to be a good fit and a value add in some seasons, and then not in others. Like it's okay to evolve in different directions. It doesn't mean that one person is bad and one person is good. It just means that you've evolved and perhaps you're no longer a good fit. But it certainly can feel brutal in a way that I think, because no one really talks or shares about it other than you, like you're the only person I've literally ever heard talk about this. We don't really have, it's not normalized. Like we don't have sort of a model to follow or a path to walk. When I watch TV or movies, it's all like people who their friendships are perfect. They never have conflicts and they've been best friends forever.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And the side of that is true too, right? I mean, the friendship breakups that we see are few and far between, but they're always tied to conflict. And that doesn't necessarily map onto everyone's experience. And when I think of romantic breakups, for example, I mean, those are portrayed all over the place, right? And not only do we see that unfolding, we also see people rallying behind the person who's experienced that breakup. And that support system really doesn't exist when it comes to our friendships. And sometimes that's because there are mutual friends involved, and that can be very complicated. But also it's because we don't talk about not just how we can cope, but how the people around us can support us when we're navigating that loss.
Oh, this is so important. It's like my favorite thing when on the podcast we can shine a light on some really common experience, like for women or for mothers, but one that like no one talks about.
Yeah.
I feel like this is so one of those, like when I was asking people like, what questions do you have about friendship? I'm going to do a podcast episode about it. So many of the people who reached out said like, it is so painful when a friendship ends. Like, why is it so painful? What can I do to make this less brutal for me when it happens? Like, why is this normal? Am I the only person that this happens to?
Yeah. No, I mean, yes, it's normal, and no, you're not alone in experiencing this. And if I, just to give a bit of numbers again, just so that you don't just take my word for it, the research coming out shows again that we can lose friends at any point in our lives, but around the age of 25 is really when we start to see a decline. And from there on out, we lose and replace about half of our friend group every 7 years. And so this process of connecting with people and losing touch with people, it's also recurring. It's not just a one-time thing. And so we would all be far better off if we not just normalize this because it's happening, but if we talked about, well, what can we do to cope in those moments? Because it is so difficult. And it really, really is a matter of treating ourselves the way we would treat somebody else that we care about, our partner, our children, a friend that we really value and hold dear. And that really starts with our self-talk.
Yes. Like what's that story that you tell yourself about, like just being conscious of those stories that you tell yourself, particularly when a friendship ends, because it can be like a valuable learning experience where you're sort of shedding things and evolving more into like the truest version of yourself. But we have to be intentional and really conscious about the meaning that we're making of these experiences, or it can do even more damage than just the pain of the friendship ending. Like I think you mentioned earlier, like where you're saying like, oh, they were awful, they did all these bad things, or like vice versa, like I'm a terrible friend, right? Like, so just being really conscious about like what lessons there are to be learned there, and that there's not necessarily blame to be had if two people are just evolving in different directions.
Yeah. What story am I telling myself about my value as a friend, about the kind of trustworthiness of the world, right? These are all the different stories that we can create that often lead us further away from that sense of connection that we really, really need and value.
Yes. Okay, let's move into our Q&A. I asked the Sage Family Village what questions they had about friendship. And somebody asks how to navigate friendships with moms whose parenting styles are more punitive or authoritarian. The difference in parenting approaches tends to cause tension and put strain on the friendship. And just for some context, I will say, Miriam, that my audience, like we are like gentle parenting, unschooling, minimalism kind of family. So we do tend to be relatively countercultural. And that is a very real challenge when you are trying to nurture these meaningful connections with people, and the way that they are treating their children feels not okay.
Yeah, there's a lot for us to unpack here, right? So, I mean, let me take a stab at this, and you'll let me know what your thoughts are too, because
Okay.
I certainly relate to this parenting approach, and so I want to make my own biases known, right? I think that that's an important part of this here. But there's also a lot of uniqueness here that, I don't homeschool my kids, and I can't even begin to imagine both the challenges that come with that and how rewarding that is, and also how that might impact conversations with strangers, with close friends, right? So yeah, all that to say, I kind of want to make that known, but here's where my mind goes. I think the first piece of any friendship conflict, and again, I think this is true of so many of our connections, but is to question, is this a, how can I put this? Is this a me thing or is this a we thing? Right? So in this exact example, and you can hopefully help me to understand this more too, is there something that the other friend has said or done to us to make us feel uncomfortable, right? Is there something this friend is saying or doing that makes us feel judged? Is there something this friend is saying or doing that puts pressure on us to change our parenting style in a way that we're just not comfortable with, right? Or is it about a situation where we feel that discomfort because we don't agree, right? And our values aren't aligned. And both of those feelings are entirely valid, right? But the starting point for how we go about navigating it may differ. Because if a friend is saying or doing something that we feel like is putting that pressure on us, is causing us pain in some way, is making it difficult to connect, then the starting point is often boundaries, right? And that can take many different forms. It might take the form of setting limits in terms of what gets discussed, right? I'm not comfortable discussing parenting decisions with you, right? Or that's not right for me and my family. And I really think that, it'd be better off if we spoke about other aspects of different things that we connect on. Setting those kinds of boundaries can be helpful. Boundaries will also be helpful if this is a situation where we are feeling that vulnerability because we don't agree with a friend's decisions. But the starting point might be a bit different. It really might involve validating our own choices and knowing in our heart of hearts that this is a choice we are making for our family. And that, as painful as it is, we don't have a say over what people say or do, right? And that's certainly true of parenting. And that is really, really hard. So anyway, that's a bit of a ramble. We can kind of circle back to any of that, but that's kind of where my mind goes. And I think that all of this is true and might be helpful no matter what the situation is, but it's really that starting point of what's the first step I need to take, right? Do I need to validate myself to set boundaries? Do I need to set boundaries to feel safe, right? Those are some of the questions that we might want to think about.
Yes. I think that a lot of people who choose to live in full alignment with their values that tend to be somewhat countercultural, that experience in and of itself can feel pretty isolating.
Yes.
And so we crave that friendship, like those meaningful friendship connections, even more because we're so isolated within the culture that's around us already. So like we're so much hungrier even for it. Because when we're just walking through the grocery store, if my toddler is throwing a tantrum and I'm sitting on the floor saying, I hear you, tell me all about it. There's already like some isolation, that might come from the people around us, whereas the other families might not be getting. So I think that like kind of acknowledging and validating that there is sort of increased need for those meaningful friendship connections going into it when you're choosing to live counterculturally is huge. And I work with a lot of families all around the world. So, I mean, in particular, if you are like literally in a culture that the parenting approach or the educational approach is is so profoundly different and like generationally different or legally different, right? There's just such a high level of isolation in that experience to begin with. So then when you're trying to connect with friends, and perhaps given where you live, you don't have the option of connecting with other people who have these values in common, like who you can share them with. I just really want to validate that, like, that is hard. Like, that's hard. Like online, like I have the Sage Family Village where really the whole point is to like connect in this like-minded community. And it's rich and it's incredible. And it's like my favorite thing in my business right now. And it's not real life. Like I can't go to the park with you, you know, like,
well, you can bring this podcast, that's for sure, but it's right. It's not the same. I think that's why it really is a both and, right? Learning and thinking about how can we set boundaries in my everyday connections in order for me to feel safe and to feel like I can be the parent that I want to be and be the friend that I want to be. And thinking about how can I connect with like-minded people who share my value system, who share my approach to parenting, so that I can feel supported in that, feel connected in that, not feel alone. And that in turn helps to bolster some of that self-talk too, right? Because telling ourselves that we're not alone, there's so much power in that, but we also want to know that we're not alone, right?
Yes. You don't like you talked about like having like the different friends meet different needs. Like so maybe like in the village, like in this online space, that's where you ask your parenting questions and that's where you share some of those parenting struggles. But then when you're at the local park, like getting together where your kids can play with these other kids, like that's not the topic of conversation. You don't show up with that area of vulnerability. Maybe you're showing up with other areas of vulnerability, but it's not that one. So like being clear on what value, you know, in what ways they do add value. And I love too that you brought that boundaries component. So like a boundary for me is that like it's not okay to hit children ever. So if someone hits a child, like I will speak to that. Like I will say like, oh, it's not okay to hit a child. Like that is a firm boundary for me. Whereas like various parenting styles and techniques is not like, so I can be in shared space with them and know that for myself, I make a different choice, and respecting the freedom of other families to make different choices. And that if I hope to influence others, the best way I can do that is not by judging or criticizing, but by just living my values out loud for the world to see, right? So that if my kid is throwing a tantrum in the grocery store, that I can sit down and just and validate and reflect and listen and hold boundaries for safety and whatnot. Like just showing up differently opens a lot of other people's minds, like if I'm hoping to influence them. But I don't go into those experiences with that intention, like to change people's hearts and minds. I just go into them to show up as my full authentic self and get some value from the connection with other people.
Absolutely. No, I think there's so much value in what you just shared, because you're very right that when we try to teach someone a lesson, right? Or when they feel like that's what we're doing, people often become very defensive. But if we can show them that there's another way, people become curious. And again, that curiosity is a catalyst, not just for connection, but for change. And so we can even model that, well, certainly indirectly, right? Showing somebody in a grocery store, hey, look, there's another way to parent. Oh, interesting. Let me go home and look that up, right? What is that? What just happened? What's the research there, right? But we can also let people know, like, you know, here's something I'm working on. Like, I'm always happy to chat about this if you ever have any questions, right? Or is this something you're struggling with too? How are you navigating it? Here's how I'm navigating this. Always willing to chat about this, right? Sometimes it's not about setting boundaries. Sometimes it's about extending that invitation in a non-judgmental way. And that is a very difficult, both decision and balance to strike, and the answer to which approach we take will likely differ depending on the situation and also the friendship in question.
Yes. I find it really helpful too, to like reframe a lot of the feedback I get from others. So if someone says like, oh, you can't let him do that, you know, like I'm reframing it as like, oh, the level of freedom I have that my child has is bringing up a lot of like discomfort and jealousy from their inner child. Like when I can reframe that in my mind, it helps me to respond with a lot more like empathy and to stay in that really practical place of like, here's my kid's need, here's this other person's need, where's the overlap? Like when I can reframe things in a way that gives me a lot more compassion for the other person.
Yeah. And I think that compassion, both for others and for ourselves, is really at the heart of again, so much of what we want to cultivate in our life.
Yes. Okay, let's move into our deep dive. So the show notes can be found at sagefamily.com/podcast74, where you can also subscribe and get future show notes sent right to your inbox. So what, Miriam, are your favorite resources for people to dive deeper into this topic of friendship? And of course, you need to include all the good stuff for you, where we can all learn from your wisdom and experience.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. So, I mean, there's so many ways that I'd love to connect. So people are welcome to visit my website, miriamkirmayer.com, where I have lots of free resources, articles, other podcast interviews on various topics related to parenting and motherhood and friendship and mental health that might be of interest. I also have a free guide there that you can download full of books, my favorite books, and again, podcasts and journals and worksheets that touch on friendships and relationships and parenting. Welcome to follow me on Instagram and join my community there, Miriam Kirmayer. That's where I talk about a lot of this, including sharing some guidance on how we can meet friends and make friends and hold on to them and let go when it's time. And I have my newsletter as well, where I share a lot of this and a little bit more of a glimpse into who I am and what my experience is with this topic.
Yeah, I'm definitely gonna go look for that toolkit of yours so I can see all your recommendations on like books and resources and all that stuff. And you are one of my favorite follows on Instagram. So I'm very particular about who I follow, about only following people who add value. And you are a tremendous value add. I think Tamara Souls is the one who originally like connected me to you. Again, those like mutual connections, right? She was like, you need to connect with Miriam. You two would be total value adds for each other. You need to connect with her. And when she said that, I started following you on Instagram, and you are still like one of the few people that consistently shows up in my feed because I'm always like commenting on your posts.
Oh, thank you for that.
But yes, everybody else needs to follow you on Instagram, subscribe to your stuff. Thank you so much for showing up for this conversation. I feel so nourished from having gotten to have it. So I'm sure that everybody out there listening is feeling the same.
Thank you. The feeling is oh so mutual. This was so wonderful. And I just so appreciate how you've encouraged me to think more deeply about some of this as well.